Hi, my name is Jenny Goranson. Most of this video will not be my face, but I wanted to say hello as a human being and so that you could see that there is a person behind the voice. Back to the video. This presentation will cover Holocaust literature in the high school English classroom, a third-generation survivor's perspective. My name is Jenny Goranson. I teach at West Springfield High School, and I'm a doctoral student in George Mason University's Writing and Rhetoric program. Some things that I hope to cover in my conversation with you are my background and the ways that my background and experiences have influenced my views of Holocaust literature, a glimpse into my teaching approach and certain lessons that I use and certain materials that I share with my students, and the ways that there can be many connections made beyond simply the Holocaust when we teach literature of this kind. It's impossible to talk about my own interactions with this topic without sharing briefly my grandparents' story. They were Polish Jews who escaped to the Russian border when war broke out in their area of Poland. And they were lucky enough to, instead of being sent to concentration camps, they spent the remainder of the war in Siberia and surrounding areas. After the war, my grandmother had no family left. We are not 100% sure what happened to them, but have searched quite hard for any evidence of their survival. And we recently have come to the conclusion that they most likely perished in Auschwitz or Treblinka. My grandfather did have some surviving relatives, and he was lucky enough to know a few of them after the war. Right after the war, they were without homes and spent time in displaced persons camps in Czechoslovakia and Germany. This picture on the right is my grandmother, my grandfather. Their names are Gittel and Gershon, and their son, Benjamin, or we call him Benji. He was born when they were in Russia, and this is before they received the good news that they were being sent to the United States to live with my grandmother's uncle, who had moved to the US many years before the war broke out. The picture on the left is the grandma and grandpa that I know. They settled down into Canton, Massachusetts, where they raised my mother and her 3 siblings. And Canton, Massachusetts also happens to be where my father grew up. So that is where... So, of course, the Holocaust is interwoven into my family story. It's the reason my mother never knew any grandparents. It's the reason that grandma would get very quiet when certain topics were brought up. It's the reason that grandpa would go into his long, angry rants. And my mother, being someone who writes herself, took it upon herself when I was a young child to start interviewing her father, Gershon. And she told me, and has shared with the rest of the family as well, that yes, she wanted to help Grandpa tell his story and record it, but a secondary motive was actually to try to stop the yelling. And so after many, many years of traveling from our home in Maine down to Canton and visiting with him and bringing a tape recorder, the result was a book called The Hand of Fate, which she wrote really as dictated by my grandfather. And so the authors are listed as George Gerzon and Helen Gerzon Goranson. It was an amazing feat when it was finally done. We knew how many hours of work went into it, and I got a more full understanding of the amount of work that went into it when I started trying to interview Grandpa and Grandma myself. The one voice that was somewhat absent from the book was my grandmother's perspective on what had happened during the war and soon after. And that's because she was the one who had been quiet about her story. I also imagine, and I can't speak for her, but she had no one except for my grandfather when the war was over. She had lost her siblings, her parents, her aunts and uncles, everyone. And I can imagine that revisiting memories of that time would just be so overwhelming. And like many Holocaust survivors, my grandparents came to the US without a lot of money, and so they really needed to stay focused on just keeping their life going um, in the US and focusing on the future. And so to me, that's how I have come to understand my grandmother's silence. When I went to college at Dartmouth, I was lucky enough to sign up for a class that was called Representing the Holocaust. I read the description, it sounded interesting. I knew I had a personal connection to the event and to the topic. And as an English major, the idea of looking at the ways that words can and cannot represent something as terrible as this really interested me. So I took the class. My professor, it was taught by Dr. Irene Kakandis, as well as a history professor named Dr. Leo Spitzer. They were a great team, and Professor Spitzer would offer the hard facts and also the not so certain facts, and offer an excellent complement to Dr. Kakandis's perspective, which was more of a comparative literature perspective and looking at the ways that different genres impact our understanding of the Holocaust. I liked that class so much that I continued and took a class called Holocaust Memory in United States and Israel, which was a fascinating class. It was taught by Marianne Hirsch, who's pictured in the bottom right. So I included these two important women in this lesson because they did write a book that's called Teaching the Representation of the Holocaust, and it could be a good one for teachers to check out because it might offer some of the insightful perspectives I gained by taking the class. One of the works that Representing the Holocaust taught me or exposed me to was Art Spiegelman's Mouse. It's a nonfiction graphic memoir, so it's kind of like a comic book, but long. But it is a true story in which Art Spiegelman tells his father's and mother's story of being in Auschwitz, also what happened before and after that. And it also is a story about him trying to get his father's story. I loved it. So many of the characters felt like they talked like my family. And the way that Art Spiegelman portrayed the unique perspective that a child of a survivor has really made me think a lot about my mother and her siblings and the ways that they may have experienced a little bit of what this author experienced. As I read the book, even just the way that Spiegelman uses dialogue and, includes the slightly broken English, it really did sound like my grandfather when the character of Vladik is telling his story. I was really inspired by everything I read in that class, but especially Mouse, and the way that really, once asked, sometimes these people really do want to share their story. So little by little, I warmed up to the idea that maybe I could do the same thing with my grandparents. I knew the basics of what had happened to them and where, but I did know that there were many unanswered questions. This is a photo with me and my grandfather. And the reason I included this photo is it sort of shows in the background the entire family, that they raised once they were in the United States, and the way that they are smiling and living as if they do not have sadness in their history. And that was so much of a part of their identity as survivors, was to not have people pity them and to not focus on the past. As I continued to think about this and continued to decide what I would do as a writer, it was very important to me that I had this relationship with Dr. Kakandis. She herself was also grappling with the question of her father's story and what he had experienced in the war. And conversations with Dr. Kakandis really gave me the courage to value my own perspective as a granddaughter. She shared that occasionally people do not speak with their own kids as comfortably as they do with their grandchildren. And I decided to sort of try that out because I did want to know what my grandparents had been through, and I considered it part of my history as well. And so I took my little tape recorder and I planned more visits than usual down to Grandma and Grandpa's house in Canton, Massachusetts. And I ended up with a box of hours worth of conversations. I ended up expanding beyond just interviewing my grandparents. I wanted to interview their children as well. So I have tapes and notes from conversations with my aunts and uncles, my mom, and this was my own attempt at sort of representing the Holocaust, or at least in a draft form. What ended up resulting was, because I was a creative writing major, I wanted to create something that would be a final project for my senior year. And so what genre ended up coming out most clearly was poetry. It's just the genre that I tend towards anyway. But occasionally poetry felt too formal. My family is a pretty informal family, so sometimes the pieces that I wrote as a result of the interviews were more like short prose pieces, really dialogue heavy, and I did certainly try to bring to life some of the funny turns of phrases that my family had, especially my grandparents. It was only partially successful, I would say. It's very difficult to write good dialogue. A lot of the pieces I wrote also had multiple narrators and were written in multiple time periods. And I think that that ended up making it really difficult to pull it together into a cohesive whole. I still sort of have a dream that one day I will, but at the moment it is incomplete. But looking back on it now, 15 years since graduating, I sort of feel that it was still a valuable experience to have, because maybe my version of the Holocaust story is various narrators in various time periods and various genres. And I do think that that plays out in my classroom in many ways. The other nice thing that came out of the experience of grappling with this type of interviewing and writing is that because of continued conversation with Professor Kokandis, I was able to work with her to co-present on the topic listed here at a conference in Louisville, Kentucky when I was a senior. And that was a really exciting experience for someone in their early 20s. And I was way over my head as far as understanding what was being discussed at the conference. It was a conference focused on narrative theory. Even now, I'm not 100% sure I know what that is, but it was an amazing experience. And I had these scholars in the room wondering what I had to say about what generationally inflected Holocaust writing was. And Professor Kakandis was just incredibly supportive, and really believed that my perspective was valuable. So, when I graduated college, a few years after that, I got into teaching, and the first school that I taught at became the school that I stayed at, West Springfield High School here in Fairfax County, Virginia. When I saw on the course curriculum that English 9, the class I would be teaching, had night, I got very excited because I, of course, had read night multiple times, both in middle school and high school, and then again in the Holocaust course I took in college. And I had so many thoughts about how I would incorporate everything I had learned. The thing that is exciting, as you all know, when you are teaching something that you are passionate about, is you're you're never dry of ideas. You're sort of overflowing with excitement and passion. The tricky part, for me at least, is because I feel that it's such an important topic, I sometimes have to make sure that I am not assuming that the students know as much as I know going into the lesson. And so that's one of the tips that I'm going to share with you. The other thing, too, is when a topic is something you feel passionate about, when the students sort of see it as yet another book they have to read and not something particularly exciting, sometimes it can be a tough blow to, especially to a brand new teacher. So I've sort of learned over the years a few tricks to help with that. And I'll just start with some of the basics when I teach night. So Elie Wiesel, as many of you know, his memoir Night is a very commonly read and commonly taught book in the secondary classroom. So the first tip that I have for you all is before beginning to read Night, make sure that you have a way of assessing what do students already know, what's their prior knowledge about these topics. So topics such as the Holocaust, World War II, Hitler, Judaism even, discrimination. And I will share with you all a prior knowledge sheet that I've typically used. And I start with them writing down anything they just think they know off the top of their heads. And then I bring in the research skills and encourage them to do some outside research, especially in the topics that they know nothing about. I teach them about what sources would be considered credible, which ones are not so credible, and it's a nice opportunity to share that. They go home, do some research, bring in the facts, and share with one another. So it's a nice opportunity for them to learn from one another and to practice those conversational skills. And then what I did learn pretty early into teaching this content is that even if they do some outside research and even if they do have some prior knowledge, the unit goes better if I do provide them with a mini lesson before we start reading about some key dates, some key figures, and some overall things they should know. And then I just find that there are fewer follow-up questions once they're reading. And it also just gives them a framework to work with. So I do recommend that. Beyond just teaching the historical facts before they start reading, I actually like to discuss some psychology terms that will end up being relevant not only in Night, but in other things that we read. And so I give them the definitions of trauma, dehumanization, desensitization, and sometimes some related terms depending on how much time we have. We talk about them not specific to the Holocaust necessarily because we haven't at that point started reading yet, but I encourage them to think about the ways that these terms could occur in other instances as well. The other thing I like to do, either before they start reading night or even towards the beginning of the night reading unit, is at one point, some conference I went to, the Holocaust Museum, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the one in DC, shared a lesson about their propaganda online exhibit. This is an online version of an actual exhibition they had at the museum. And because I lived here, I was lucky enough to go to that actual exhibition. But this online exhibit is just amazing because it manages to be interactive. It has videos, it has photos, it has questions to answer. It's very engaging. And the other thing that the web quest that the museum share with us includes is 6 media literacy questions, which can be relevant even today with any media message. So I'm going to just take a minute to show you what this website looks like. So this is the main page, and you can see it has a few different things to click on. The web quest, what you're going to need to click on for most of the web quest is this thing that says themes. And because this was created a while ago, you do have to click this in order for it to work the way it should. So as you can see, very showy. And they have it organized by theme. So these are actual propaganda posters utilized during the Nazi regime. And it doesn't just stick with posters. Some of it is, radio, the way radio was used, the way film was used. But they organize it into themes, which is really great for instructional purposes. So there's making a leader, rallying the nation, indoctrinating the youth, defining the enemy, writing the news, assessing guilt, and deceiving the public. And what's so great about thinking about this thematically is this applies to not only Nazi propaganda, but propaganda in general. And the online exhibit does a really good job of making those connections. So they even have a timeline that the earliest date is long before World War II, and the latest date is 2008, which, if I remember correctly, may be when they put on this exhibit. So they really do try to make these connections. So that's great. It provides a lot of background info. The kids can move at their own pace. And the way the webquest is set up, it also has a part where it sort of says, go to the artifacts library and click on one that looks interesting to you. The other thing that's great is they translate any German words if you hover over the text. So lots of really interesting, exciting things you could do in the classroom with this. The 6 media literacy questions, just so that you know what they are, can be found in the WebQuest file, which will be shared with you. So when you open the WebQuest file, this is the handout that the students would get. It defines media literacy. It explains why it's important. And then these are the 6 media literacy questions, which they're great questions to ask. Who created this message? What is the purpose? What biases does the author bring to the story? And then it defines what a bias is. What creative techniques are used to attract and hold attention? And creative could mean sort of emotion, color, catchy phrases, anything like that. How might different people understand this message differently? What values, lifestyles, and points of view are represented in this message? And what is omitted from the message? And then as they go through different parts of the online exhibit, they fill in the different boxes. By the time they've finished this is where they pick one of the posters, other than this one, where the sample is using that one, and basically go through and analyze it based on each of these media literacy questions. So it's a great practice in not only their analysis skills, but it's actually kind of research in a way, because these are primary sources and they are learning right from the source, sort of how did this terrible thing happen in history. I mentioned it before, but I decided I would pull it up now just so that you could see. This is the sheet that I usually share with students to gauge their prior knowledge, and then I have them conduct additional research at home. So it gets them to think about what is a memoir, these other topics: World War II, Adolf Hitler, the Holocaust, Holocaust survivors, persecution, trauma, dehumanization, and Transylvania, which is the area of Romania that Ali Wiesel comes from. So even if you don't do the entire web quest with your students, as I mentioned, I just think that this website is a wealth of information and could serve as a great resource for teachers in a variety of subject areas. So you do want students to eventually start reading the book. Because it is a true story, I often will notice that students are more engaged in this book than they are in some other works. Some methods that I try to use while they're reading is to request that they come in with some questions and run a student-led discussion rather than a discussion that's led by me. I will serve as facilitator and certainly clear up any areas of confusion, but they do need the practice in running the conversation themselves. We do examine the language that Wiesel uses. This is a book in which you don't have long, flowery descriptions, and yet there's a lot of complicated, complex issues explored. So it's a short book. It's maybe 92 pages long, and yet he does a lot of really innovative things with figurative language and with unusual syntax. And as English teachers, it's just rich with possibilities. And students do pick up on new things every time I teach it. They teach me something new. We have frequently done journals after each chapter. Rather than having them do a literary analysis type of essay, I find that some kind of writing in which they can process their emotions about what's happening feels more appropriate. Analytical paragraphs where they pick an impactful quote and analyze what is being shown about the situation or about Ellie's character. Sometimes they'll be analyzing a certain motif, such as father and son. There's a lot of father and son pairs in this book. As a creative approach to writing in relation to this book, I introduced them to found poetry, which, for those of you who don't know, it's basically taking excerpts from an existing text and putting them together into a new poem that sometimes is on the same topic, occasionally it's on a different topic, and it's been a nice way for students to honor the language that Wiesel used, but also make something of their own with it. As they wrap up the book, they always want to know, well, what happened after that? And I tell them that there are many autobiographical pieces that have been written by Wiesel. He's pretty prolific as a writer. He has, I think, 2 multi-hundred-page autobiographies. But what we look at as a glimpse into his views towards the end of his life is an interview that appeared in O, the Oprah magazine, in November of 2000. Oprah interviews Wiesel, and you get basically a transcript of how the conversation transpired. And it really ends the night unit in a nice way because Wiesel manages to be so hopeful and so positive in some ways. He really committed himself to fighting for human rights all over the world, partly due to what he went through. So it manages to feel uplifting after reading a very, very sad book. There are also many film clips available of this, of Oprah talking to Elie Wiesel. There's even a documentary where Oprah and Wiesel walk around Auschwitz, and he sort of talks about different things that happened in different parts, and it's very cold and wintry, and that's what this photo is from. Because we're talking at that point about Elie Wiesel as not a concentration camp prisoner, but as a survivor, it's a nice opportunity to talk about other survivors. We also like to look at different genres, and so this kind of goes back to that course I took in college called Representing the Holocaust. Poetry allows for a different type of representation, and I hand out a packet of different survivors' poems, and they each take a totally different angle. This book, Auschwitz and After, by Charlotte Delbo, is kind of a combination of poetry and prose in which she really explores this idea of what do you do when you're one of the few who did survive a horrific event. So I have them read and practice annotation. And some years I even share some of the pieces that I wrote about the Holocaust, just for them to see the ways that this historic event sort of trickles down through the generations as well. Some years, if I have enough extra time, this hasn't happened for a long time, but some years I will show them the film Life is Beautiful, which is fictional. However, it is a really different portrayal of the Holocaust. The father essentially makes up a fictional reality for his son about the camp that they're at. Definitely watch it at some point if you haven't. Students really had strong reactions to this movie, and it led to some good discussions about what is truth and is it okay to tell white lies sometimes. And then just how important it is to try to stay positive when things are bleak. So it's a beautiful film. When I started teaching night at West Springfield High School, it was either 1 or 2 years into my time teaching there that I asked the department chair at the time if there might be the money to purchase some copies of Mouse 1 and 2. There had been recent research done about graphic novels and how they can really help with reluctant readers. So I think it was some combination of that and the fact that this is a pretty highly acclaimed book, and it seemed like a natural pairing tonight. So they said yes, and we purchased enough copies so that all the English 9 teachers could teach it if they wanted to. And I'm really pleased at how it's gone. I may be the only teacher who teaches both books in their entirety, but it works really well as a comparison right after night. Some things to know about Mouse 1 and 2. It's not a sequel situation. It was published in 2 parts. I think probably partly just due to Spiegelman's financial situation at the time, but it is really a whole story. So parts 1 and 2 together give you the full story. So it's told mostly chronologically, but there is some darting back and forth between the present day when Art Spiegelman is interviewing his dad and the dad's stories that he's telling Spiegelman. Interesting fact about this book, most of the characters are not human. They are portrayed as animals. And yet the author, Art Spiegelman, really fought hard for it to be designated as nonfiction. He argued that every fact that's in this story is completely true, and it's based on, interviews that I conducted, and I have the recordings to prove them. And the fact that the characters are animals is just part of my truth. So that was an interesting thing. I don't think everyone agreed with him, but he mainly won that battle, and his work, Mouse 1 and 2, is now categorized as a graphic memoir, not a graphic novel. Before starting Mouse, some great entry questions for the students that you always get some great responses to are to ask them if they've ever tried interviewing someone in their family, or even if it wasn't a formal interview, have they ever tried just asking a parent or a grandparent or even a neighbor something about their past, and especially if it was far back in their past, what ended up being challenging about the conversation, and also what was enjoyable about it. So basically, what what can you learn from people's life stories? And students have shared many things about that over the years. And then lastly, we talk about why do you not always get a clear story? And then of course, that's an opportunity for me to share the way that when we would begin to talk, when my grandmother and I would begin to talk about the parts of the war that the rest of our family didn't know much about, at least from her perspective, suddenly she would want to make me a sandwich or something else to change the topic. And this happens a lot in Mouse as well, where Art is just really trying to get a straight story out of his dad and he cannot do it. So we talk about the ways that sometimes people want to avoid certain topics as a coping mechanism. And sometimes they don't even know that they're doing that, but we like to go into some of the psychological aspects of it. So, a big important disclaimer about Mouse. It was written for an audience of adults, and so I do believe that it's an important work of literature to share with high school students, but it would probably be wise for any of you, if you're considering incorporating it into your classroom, to either send a letter home or make something clear in the syllabus that you send home to students and parents that Mouse does contain some graphic content. Art's mother, after the war, dealt with some pretty serious mental health issues and does ultimately commit suicide. So that topic is mentioned a few times. There's also a small image, it's not very big, of Spiegelman's mother nude. And I did have a year where there was one parent who wanted to call a meeting about concerns with choosing Mouse as something to study in the classroom. The main things that got her attention were these issues that I've just mentioned. And also in the About the Author section, it mentions that it lists some of the publications that Spiegelman had been published in at the time. And it lists many reputable publications, but in the long list, it also mentions that he was published in Playboy, which really concerned this parent. In the meeting, we sort of discussed that occasionally Playboy actually publishes some pretty good writing. And that was an interesting meeting, but I would definitely read it fully yourself, know your students, know the community that you're working with, and sort of give that pre-warning, and then you should be fine. I'm not an expert, but I think middle school teachers might want to consider reading excerpts if they were going to read Mouse. But you know your students best, so you can make that decision. It is a good idea to, before just giving them the books and saying start reading, to discuss the genre a little. Some kids will know the genre very well. They may have read everything on the graphic novel shelf in the library. They may have never seen it before. So you kind of get a range of experiences. But I always sort of begin by doing a little mini lesson about the term comic book. So these slides that are in gray are an excerpt from that lesson. So I'll just kind of run through what I say to the kids. The term comic book was first used in 1934, which is a long time ago, but also not too long ago. So here are some common comics from the 20th century. You've got humor over here, you've got superhero over here, you've got kids over here. So it's not very formal. It's maybe the stuff that is more associated with children. And yet, comic books are a lot older than that. So if you think about sequential art, which is really just a fancy word for comics, Egyptian tombs that were painted over 32 centuries ago contained sequential art. So even before the written word, we had comics, if you want to think of it that way. Another example in other cultures would be Japanese scrolls, Greek painting, and pre-Columbian Mexican manuscripts. Comics are part of a very old tradition. But a comic book about the Holocaust, this is surprising for many people. So how does this compare to other ways you've learned about the Holocaust here in school or elsewhere? Students have many answers to this. They basically say, it's never cartoons. And I agree with them. It's rarely a topic that's covered in cartoons. And I think that that's part of what Art Spiegelman was trying to do, is really break the mold and use the genre that was his favorite genre and the genre that he worked in to tell his family's story. So what I try to share with them is that even though it's called a comic book, now in the era of graphic novels and graphic memoirs, they no longer need to be just for kids. They no longer need to be just funny stories or just superheroes. They can actually be real, true stories about people's lives as well. This is a slide that opens up the conversation about the fact that a photograph is usually just one person. Then when you make it a little more cartoon-like, it could be a few people. Then as you make it more and more cartoon-like and more basic, it could be thousands of people. Then it could be millions. And then once you reduce it to just two eyes and a mouth, it could be nearly all. And I ask students to look at the image and to talk about why does this help us understand why some people feel that the graphic memoir form is even more personal than, say, a novel, because a cartoon could be anyone. The other side of it, though, is that when we make a character a cartoon, are we in a way stereotyping? And how does that relate to the Holocaust? So we could say, oh, it's just a cartoon. Mouse is just a cartoon. But I encourage them before they start reading to be ready for it to be more than just a cartoon. And this is one way of thinking of it. With a comic book or a graphic novel, you are with the author. It's very intimate. You can actually usually see the author's pen strokes. Sometimes you can see their handwriting. This quote from Will Eisner really pulls together what's so powerful about the comic book and graphic novel genre. The regimens of art and the regimens of literature become superimposed upon one on each other. The reading of the comic book is an act of both aesthetic perception and intellectual pursuit. So, with that mindset, they begin reading Mouse. I share with them some essential questions to sort of keep in mind as they read, and they love reading it. It's a real page turner. It's a break from text only works. They enjoy the pictures. They also really care about the characters. And our discussions about Mouse feel really energized, I think partly because it is a book about the Holocaust, but it's also a book about father-son relationships, a little bit about different nationalities, relationships with one another. And in a way, it's kind of an action-packed story as well, because you basically follow Vladek, Art's dad, and see how things turn out for him. So some essential questions that I encourage students to answer or think about as we read Mouse. Why did Spiegelman choose to portray the characters as animals? Why cats, mice, dogs, pigs, etc.? And they come up with some great ideas on this. I encourage them to think about all the different connotations of those animals and to think about what nationalities, what connotations the different nationalities portrayed in the book would have for an author such as Spiegelman. I asked them to think about, why does Spiegelman include himself in the story? Which were the most moving uses of the visual component, and why? We talk about, why are certain frames larger, and how is the black ink used more on one page and less on another. So they're really analyzing images in addition to the text. I asked them to compare what it was like to read Mouse to what it was like to read Night or the poems. And then I also encourage them to think about, if they were to write a graphic novel about their life or about an event from their life, what animals or other metaphor would you use to represent the different people in your life? And they enjoy that creative activity. And some years I've even had them draw a few frames of what that graphic novel would look like. It is really a unique opportunity to hear from an author about what he had hoped would, what he planned to do when he was writing the book. So after we read Mouse, I have them watch at least one of these videos. So the links are here. The first one, video about MetaMouse, maybe 10 years ago, Spiegelman released a book called MetaMouse, which is an in-depth discussion of his process in writing Mouse. It includes a CD with many different videos and recordings on there, and other multimedia files. There's even recording of him actually interviewing his dad. It's fabulous for kids who really want to go deeper. So this first video is Spiegelman talking about the release of the book, and you really feel like you get his sense of humor and also his, quirky way of looking at the world in that video. And the second video is the one that I sometimes show right after they finish Mouse 1 and they haven't yet gotten into Mouse 2. And it's a nice little break for them to hear from Art Spiegelman why he chose to use animals. Because for some of the kids who aren't as much abstract thinkers, they're still a little confused, why are the pigs poles, and so on. So that one is great, and both of them would be excellent supplements to a unit about Mouse. We wrap up the Holocaust literature unit with some kind of big picture discussion about genre and about content. And this very complicated Venn diagram is one way that I've facilitated that discussion in the past. So basically, they think about, of all the things that we've looked at, what are some commonalities that some of them share, and then what are some unique perspectives that they each have that the others do not. So that's kind of a nice organizational method for them to use Venn diagrams. I really truly believe that there are so many reasons to teach Holocaust literature beyond the most important one, which is, of course, to make sure that this kind of thing does not happen again in history. But these are just some additional connections that, even if you didn't care about sort of avoiding a terrible event like this in the future, these are some additional reasons that I feel these units can be super relevant to other aspects of students' lives. So the 6 media literacy questions that I shared in the web quest, I mean, they are just important questions to keep in mind anywhere. So especially in the age of social media, the importance of examining who is creating this message and why, and what is being omitted. And those types of questions are just so important. They also really respond to thinking about not just World War II, but other instances of propaganda, other instances of trauma, other instances of dehumanization. They bring in a lot from their other history classes. They often can bring in information that their parents have shared with them about places that they maybe used to live. I teach many students from immigrant families, and they talk about trying to talk with their parents about the old country, and the parents say that it's not worth talking about. It's not, it would just make them upset. So they sort of, the idea of the struggle of talking with someone about a difficult memory is very relevant to some of my students. They connect to Elie Wiesel's efforts to fight for human rights, even after he had been treated so poorly by other humans. So they find that very inspirational, and we sometimes talk about other people who've taken a horrible experience, and instead of letting it break them, they use the fact that they survived to make other people's lives better. And then, of course, because they're teenagers, the idea of having conflict with your parents is very easy for them to talk about, and the ways that Art treats his dad poorly, but then there are also moments where Vladik does not treat Art very well either. So the fact that it's a two-way street. Of course, because it's an English class, we are constantly asking, how does language operate in all of these instances? And what are some moments where language is really effective? And then also, what cannot be expressed in words? Are there things about the Holocaust that just cannot be represented? And does that mean that we give up, or do we continue to try to represent it? And they have now seen examples of the ways that different genres have different strengths. And they can then decide what genre do they wish to use if they ever want to tell their story, or could it be a mix of genres? The other thing that's great about teaching Mouse is that it's kind of a gateway to some other true stories that have been told in this format. And these are just a few titles that were on my shelf that I've had students respond to. We have Persepolis, Mom's Cancer, and March. So check those out if you're interested in the graphic memoir format. And some students, especially reluctant readers, just really latch on to reading once they connect with the graphic novel, graphic memoir genre. And Art Spiegelman was very much one of the pioneers in that field when he wrote Mouse, but now there are books on almost every topic, love stories, science fiction stories, true stories, funny stories, serious stories. And so if they go to the library, the part of the library that has that genre, they will have every kid can find something that they would love in that genre. And there's actually a lot of research being done about the ways that reading graphic novels can actually improve reading text-only text as well. Maybe the most important thing that may not have nothing to do with the Holocaust is I think that by talking about Art's search for his family's story and by sharing my own search for my family's story, I hope that students, you know, leave my class knowing that it's valuable to learn one's own story. It may not be their family story, it might be their country's story, it might be their town's story, but to basically know that there is a power in connecting to what came before you and who came before you. And I know that it is meaningful to me, and I believe that to many of my students, they begin to see towards the end of high school, sometimes right as they're saying goodbye to their family, that they have a family with a story that's worth telling. Here are the works that I cited within the presentation. And thank you for spending the time with me on this video. I hope that you were able to find at least a few things that could be useful in your own classroom. Here's my email if you have any follow-up questions. And best of luck.